Okay, hello. So if you've never seen an ex-professional wrestler as part of a Japanese pop metal group before, there you go. We'll talk a little bit today about gender identity and language and all that stuff. So there is a little bit of a relationship between that group and just self-expression and identity and all that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting to see two old uh, ladies just react to that kind of stuff and take it so positively. Anyways, assignment 3 is released now. I don't have the video up, so I figured I'd just do it at the beginning of lecture because uh, we still have a lot of stuff. Well, not a lot of stuff relative to some of the lectures in the course. Um, we shouldn't take the full 3 hours today, so I thought I'd just do it as part of the lecture. So psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics will be able to talk about. I'll also talk about the computational linguistics questions, which you'll be able to understand, and you should actually be able to complete at this point, except for a couple of the small details that we'll talk about next week. So you can just sort of take a look. So um, same instructions as always. This is due in 2 weeks. The first question is about singular they. And this is an extension of the gender mismatch effects that we talked about in lecture. So in lecture, we talked very specifically about he and she. So when you have words like secretary, which has a stereotype, and you encounter a mismatch, you have different processing and rating effects. And when you encounter a word like intern, which has gender unknown, and you say find he or she, you have different effects. So with a gender unknown antecedent like intern, he and she are both acceptable, and there's no issues with processing because it's intern. There's no gender associated with it. So if you say intern he or intern she, it's fine. But very recently, in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of research on singular they. What happens when you use a gender neutral antecedent, or sorry, a gender neutral pronoun? And they is always a bit of an issue for people. Um, some for social reasons, some political reasons, and some because people think that they is plural and they can't be singular. And these are all valid reasons for individual people, but linguistically, they can be singular in English. So for a lot of people, they can be used to refer to specific types of antecedents. It's just that people don't realize it. This knowledge is inaccessible to people. So studies have looked at different types of antecedents, so secretary and intern and so on. And what you're doing is you're taking a look at some example sentences, you're taking a look at some example data, and you're basically just answering questions about the data. So I'm not giving you like very descriptor, very numerical data and intense data. I'm just giving you some summaries. So for example, um, here is some example sentences of what you're looking at, so you have an idea of what these sentences look like and what each type of antecedent is. And then I'm saying, okay, um, for each type of sentence, here's the reading time at the pronoun, and here's the reading time after. So you have a rough idea of how the results come out. And then here's how natural people rate them out of 7. And there's a little bit more description in the text of what this means in terms of how good or bad it is. And then there's some questions here that basically ask you about certain things. Like question 1 is like, according to the processing times, is singular they more difficult than, uh, for gender stereotype or gender unknown? So you just look at the data there and you say, okay, which ones are slower? So you're just going to take a look at the data here and figure out like what's actually happening with singular they. And the questions are quite specific, so that way I'm trying to lead you to an answer piece by piece rather than just having you analyze everything at once, because it's quite a bit when we haven't really taken a look in depth at a lot of like uh, data grids. So I've tried to keep it simple. And there's another interesting angle at this. So not only is there like a psycholinguistic component to this, where there's data sets, but there's also a sociolinguistic component, because this is real data. This comes from real participants. because I try to make these things like real world application. And in this experiment, when looking at singular they, the participants not only identified themselves as real people, but they also identified themselves as whether they were cisgender or non-binary. And in case people are not familiar with that, cisgender person is someone who was born male or female and identifies as that gender. So if they're male and they're born male, they identify as male, they use he, him to refer to themselves, and they want others to use he, him as pronouns. Non-binary would be someone who is born male or female, but they don't identify as male or female. And usually someone who's non-binary um, would use pronouns like they, them. So instead of saying like, I know him to refer to someone who's non-binary, you would say, I know them. This is a generalization. Not every non-binary person would do that, but this is a trend. So the data in terms of how natural these sentences are also split up between cisgender and non-binary people. And it's also split up between people who are exposed and not exposed. So people who have friends that use these pronouns and people who do not have friends that use those pronouns. So you're also going to take a look at to see how the naturalness ratings differ from those aspects and to sort of discover like, what are the issues here? Like who is rating singular they as bad? Is it a gender difference that's causing this, or is it more like an exposure thing? Is it because some people have friends who are non-binary and that's why they're rated high because they're used to using them, or are they rating them low because they don't have friends and they never use them, so it's unnatural because they haven't seen them before? So um, there's quite a bit of text here, and the text is used to sort of lead you through the data, and the questions are quite specific. So yeah, 7 questions here, a little bit more parts than usual, but that's the psycholinguistics question. So definitely read through the psycholinguistics lecture notes on GMMEs to start this question, just as a refresher. And if you have any questions about this, as always, just ask me or contact me. I'm happy to clarify anything. So it's not completely 100% psycholinguistics. It's sort of a mix between psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics to sort of bridge the gap between two fields that seem quite separate in terms of how we talked about them in lecture. But, you know, they interact quite a bit when we want them to. For sociolinguistics, this is something that we're going to talk about today. But sociolinguistics is about language use and how society uses them. So we're going to talk about language contact, when two languages come together and they start to share words. So a Hawaiian borrows a lot of words from English. So in this question, you're going to take a look at some Hawaiian words, or sorry, some English words that have been borrowed into Hawaiian, and take a look at how the pronunciation has changed. So for example, newspaper has become nupepa, and uncle has become anakala, and sopa has become kopa. So question by question, I sort of lead you through question 1, like which consonant sounds are gone. Question 2, Merry Christmas has changed and added a lot of vowels. Why is that? Question 3, oh, these specific sounds have changed. Which ones have they changed into? And then question 4, do your best to translate my name into Hawaiian pronunciation. And that's a hard question, but by doing question 1, 2, and 3, I think you can do it. Why are you translating my name? 2 reasons. 1, you can't use Google to do it. There's a lot of words I wanted you to do it. Then I Googled them to see if they were already translated, and they were. So my name is not on Google. And 2, um, parts of my name are in the words above in the list. So it's there's quite a few hints for how to do it in the word list. There's just a couple sounds you'll have to figure out, and I've given a hint there. For the computational linguistics question, next week we're going to focus more so on the applications, so language and technology, rather than like the nitty-gritty details of what the computer is thinking and how it's actually parsing sentences and so on. So for one of the questions, you're going to talk with 2 different chatbots for a bit. and you're going to see how the chatbots respond to you and if they're able to keep up with you. So you're going to talk to a really old chatbot called Eliza, and you're going to talk to one of the not newer chatbots, but one of the ones in the 2010s called Cleverbot, and just answer a couple questions about them. And for the last question, you're going to do a quick couple lessons on Duolingo. You're going to learn one lesson in Swedish, and you're going to do some critiques of Duolingo. So this question is much more of an opinion-based question than it is anything else. I'm really just curious to see, after everything you've learned in the course, what you think about Duolingo after learning about language acquisition, after learning about the different sounds, words, and sentences. You know, how you think Duolingo is, if you really think it's an effective way to learn language at this point. So that's sort of like the final question in the course is use Duolingo and give it your best critique. So I don't want to influence you too much, but question 3 is pretty influential when I say that Duolingo is often criticized as being useless in the real world. But that is sort of just a fact. So this assignment is definitely a little bit lighter than the last one in terms of the difficulty of the questions. Assignment 2, I mean, the average is about the same as assignment 1 overall, which is good, but I know that assignment 2 was definitely harder in terms of the amount of mental effort required to answer those questions. So I try to give a little bit more of some interesting real life applications on this one, especially towards the end of the course when we're all losing a little bit of motivation. So are there any immediate questions about assignment 3? I mean, I'll come back and ask again next week, but are there any initial impressions or comments? Assignment 2 grades will be released very shortly. They're all graded at this point, but the information in the rubrics have to be copied over to students and groups. So if I release them right now, there'd be like 50 students who don't have grades input because the comments haven't been copied over. So that's how I can comment on the average, because I know that the average is the same as assignment 1, but the group members just don't have the grades in yet. Okay. So this is the second set of sociolinguistics slides, which I just need to double check because I did this. I think I put it up 2 days ago. I just need to make sure it is up because yes, part 2 is up. Okay, perfect. I was a little bit out of my mind when I was uploading the slides from the vaccine. Okay. So today we're talking about language and gender, culture and thought. So does language determine thought, or does language influence thought? And then some accents and dialects, and then we'll end with contact. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about is really just information. So what I mean by information is that it's a little bit more like just facts on a slide rather than explaining concepts, at least more so than it has been in the past. So I might go a little bit more quickly through the slides that are just facts that can be read, and spend more time on the stuff that can be explained and conceptualized, just so we can have a little bit of a shorter week. So of course, everything on the slides is important, but just so you're aware. Of course, I won't skip over anything important. Okay. So language and gender. In the past, a lot of the studies in sociolinguistics has been focused very specifically on the differences between men and women. Now, In the past 6 or 7 years, this narrative has changed quite a bit. And now it's really about sexuality and identity, but specifically the differences between gender identity. So we make this distinction in terms. So gender identity is about what people feel about themselves. So how people identify as masculine or feminine or a male or female. So this is how people think about themselves. Uh, People think about themselves, and we contrast this with biological sex. So of course, this is uh, uh, how you're born. So we make the distinction between gender identity and sex. So biological sex. So we use these terms just to make sure that when we're clear, because there are some things that matter for like neurolinguistic and biological differences. So there are things that do matter when we do neurolinguistic studies for differences in biological sex. So we use sex specifically to mean differences between male and female. Well, so this really is the focus, gender identity in sociolinguistics. And with modern studies, basically everything after 2015, this is usually what we mean when we say the difference between male and female. Uh, there's not too many studies out there that do look at, say, non-binary or transgender participants, but more and more are coming up, and more are being done now. So a lot of the studies are also how words reflect the culture. So how many words are used in a language that reflect sort of like sexist notions? Like how many words use like how many words that have a female morpheme? Like what do those words mean? Do they mean um, uh, good things, or do they mean bad things like foolish? If we think of phrases that we have in English, like, oh, it's just an old wives' tale. Uh, I don't know if you've heard this, a wives' tale before. A wives' tale usually means that it's like not a fact, but something that's made up in the past. Like, for instance, when you shave, hair grows back thicker. That's not true. That's something in English called a wives' tale. But this is somewhat sexist language. You're using a female word to describe something that's not true. If you think about a term like uh, a fairy tale, and if you think about the word fairy as well, do you have a gender associated with the word fairy when you think of a fairy? Is there a stereotype associated with fairy in your head? Do you think of a male or a female when you think of the word fairy? Because this is also a tale that is fake. And usually when people respond and say, I have an association with fairy, they think of, yeah, in Western culture, Tinkerbell, they think of a female. So there's usually also this woman, the concept of woman in language might lead to fake or not real or lesser. So the cultural attitude is reflected in language. And that doesn't mean that the language itself is sexist or that the people who use the language is sexist, but rather that the cultural attitude in general, whether that's historical, that's brought in the past, some aspect of that culture is reflected in the language. So we'll see some examples of this as we go on. And we'll also talk about how things are changing uh, in order to reflect modern culture. So let's actually talk about some differences between men and women. So here's a biological difference between men and women. So if we take a look at how we talk with pitch, There is a difference in the length of the vocal tract. And this difference in length causes a difference in pitch. So the shorter the vocal tract, the higher the pitch. So on average, women's voices are between 160 to 300 hertz. So that is their pitch. And while males' voices are typically between 60 to 180 hertz. So this is where you get your deeper voices, and this is where you get your higher voices. But there is overlap. So as you can see, it's 60 to 100, or so 160 is the lower range, 180 is the higher range. So this is just like this is a range. So this is about 95% of all people is in here. So obviously you have women that are lower than 160 and higher than 300. You have men higher than 180 and lower than 60. But there is overlap. Okay. Now, there's also this trend that says that lower pitched voices are more commanding, they're authoritative. Okay, but this is not a fact of biology. The fact that lower pitched voices connote authority is not a biological fact. This is a social fact. And whether your voice is higher pitched or lower pitched, so higher or deeper, is also rather tied to gender identity than biological sex. So typically, people who identify, so if you're born a male and you identify as female, or you're born a female and you identify as male, you'll find that the pitch of your voice does shift a little bit as you change your identity. You can also use drugs to change this, so hormone replacement therapy, that will change the length of your vocal tract as well. But consciously or subconsciously, with identity change, the pitch does change a little bit as well. Not very drastically, but it does change. So pitch, there's a bit of a different, well, there's a large difference due to biological differences, but there's also some minor differences due to how you identify. So there's some social overlap, but there's a lot of biological differences here. I just saw that comment, women aren't real. What an absurd comment. One of the other one of the other differences is the use of standard forms. And again, what I want to emphasize here is that this here is a difference in identity. So this is a tendency, and there is a tendency for women to use more standard forms while men to use more non-standard forms. So nowadays, we talked about last week, like the N, like the sound for ing, like with swimming. So if we think of the as being the standard way of pronouncing it, and the N as being the non-standard way, we would find that women tend to say swimming more than men, and men would tend to say swim in more than women. If we contrast, say, a syntactic pattern like I didn't do anything, anything would be the standard form, while men might say I didn't do nothing more. Here, of course, we have a double negative. I didn't do nothing. So a double negative would be a non-standard form. Now, this tendency is really just for strangers. So when you talk to people you don't know, when you talk to people you do know, these tendencies just disappear. So when talking with your friends, women and men, there's no statistical difference between how they talk. Now, the question, women tend to use more standard forms while men tend to use more non-standard forms with strangers. Is this really a gender difference, or are there just other factors that are contributing to this? I mean, talking to strangers, using more standard forms and non-standard forms, if we think about language, and we think about, I don't know, the safety or the threats that women might feel depending on who they're talking to. Uh, I don't know, the need to uh, the instant camaraderie that men might feel talking to anyone, the fact that they can say whatever they want and not have to feel the punishments depending on their social status. I mean, there's a lot of different other confounds that could be um, in play here other than just gender. So, uh, yeah, it's just a tendency. An interesting fact about men saying that they tend to use more non-standard forms is that actually um, men will say that they use even more non-standard forms than they actually do. And this is called covert prestige. It's also been dubbed as street cred. So basically, they want to sound like they're even, uh, that they deviate even more from the standard than they actually do. So you might have men that say swim in like 10% of the time, and they will say, no, I say it like all the time. Yeah, covert prestige sounds cooler than street cred. And covert prestige, if we think about covert prestige and street cred, covert prestige would be like the standard form, and street cred would be like the non-standard form. But we would say that men would tend to prefer probably saying street cred, and if we follow this pattern, then women would tend to prefer to say covert prestige. But of course, is this really a gender difference, or are there other factors coming in? So um, again, like these are older studies, right? So a lot of these beginning facts are older studies that probably need to be revisited at this time. Uh, Another interesting fact is that um, when change happens, women tend to adapt it first. Women, uh, when they see change that is good for society, that comes from the upper classes, um, they will use it more often than men. So men just prefer non-standard forms, and they're more resistant to change than women. That is another tendency. Could this relate to the recent AAV as a cooler form of language, or has this been the case for a long time? Um, well, I mean, this is considered to be just a generic fact. Men prefer to say or to keep the non-standard forms. So, I mean, this could be a case. I don't know if it's a recent trend of AAV being cooler form of language. It could just be the fact that more people are now exposed to it and that we're able to see that. Um, so that's why it appears cooler and it's reaching more people. That could be one reason why it's more explosive. Um, but I think this would explain it, explain why people do use it and want to use it, but why it's cooler now and more explosive could just be the fact that it is reaching people more and more people are seeing it and more people can discuss it. There's also political reasons because as more progressive language is pushed on people, there's also more of a resistance to use language that pushes against it. But that's a political discussion more so than a language discussion. I mean, it is kind of both, but that's something I don't quite want to get into unless it's relevant for the course discussion. So we'll see. Um, so more differences, uh, and this is really as you'll see throughout the lecture, I want you to question a lot of this stuff when we say that there's gender differences, because there might always be different confounds that come in. And this is really where it is. So with conversation focus, Deborah Tannen originally suggested that men and women have different conversation focuses. And that's women have this focus on intimacy. And intimacy is that you want connections with others in conversations, and you want to avoid superiority and reach some sort of mutual understanding. While men want to focus on independence, men want to be at the top, they want to give orders. Uh, they don't really care about any sort of equality. So this these two different types of focus and conversation lead to two things called gender lex. So it's like a dialect, but it's a gender lex. So depending on if you're a man or a woman, you have a difference in the conversational style. So women focus on intimacy, men focus on independence. But I mean, like, is this really the case? Uh, is this something that happens in every situation? Is this something that happens just depending on who you're talking to? Like, what else really goes on? Can you think of any other factors that might determine which style of conversation or which focus of conversation you're choosing? That's not just gender based. Yeah, the jobs that people have is great. Of course, it's the jobs that people have that's massive. Social status, workplace hierarchy. I mean, yeah, if you're an employee talking to an employer, you don't really have a choice. You're going to be as intimate as you can if you're an employee trying to work your way up. If you're the boss, you're probably going to be a little bit more independent, depending on the work environment, depending on how many people you have to manage. Yeah, past experiences, that's going to shape your way a lot. If you've been intimate a lot and you've had a lot of failure being intimate in your conversation focus, you might have realized it doesn't work and you're going to try being independent, vice versa. So although the initial assumption is perhaps a good guess about what's happening, a good tendency, a good observation at first, there's a lot of confounds and a lot of other factors that come into play. So it's good to explore those things and think about those. Yeah, cultural influence too is huge. It's huge. Um, yeah, depending on the culture you're in. So yeah, if you're raised, well, it's hard to give specific examples when I'm so ingrained in Canadian culture. Um, but Yeah, I mean, you can imagine someone who's grown up in a very cutthroat environment from birth. If you're born into a very rich family where you see your parents as bosses who are just constantly climbing up the social hierarchy, giving orders to people, you're going to take a lot of influence from that. So, say there's a tendency, but there's a lot of other stuff going on here. Now, talking about some old beliefs. I'm sure you've all had relatives, or at least know someone who has spouted some sort of nonsense before, like, oh, women talk more than men, or at least you've heard it on the radio or TV. The radio, what am I talking about? These are things my parents would say. I've never listened. Okay, whatever. That's not relevant. This has been studied. Who talks more, men or women? Well, how do you test this? Well, in the real world, of course, you get some participants, you attach a device to them that records their conversation. So while they go out throughout the day, they record snippets of conversation. And by recording, say, like every 5 minutes, so you take like 5 minutes out of an hour and you do that for like 8 hours a day from like 400 participants, and you extrapolate and figure out, okay, so based on these 5 minute samples, how many words per day are spoken? So that's what these researchers did. And they found that on average, people say about 16,000 words a day. And it's not specific genders that have any difference, it's just people. So you can have some people who talk a hell of a lot, and you can have some people that don't really talk at all. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. What matters is if you're a person who talks a lot or a person who doesn't talk much at all. So they got 210 women, 186 men, all university students. So, I mean, this is the age where you're probably talking the most. And they found, yeah, like this women don't talk more than men. How do we know the study would be accurate if people knew they were being recorded? Couldn't that prompt bias or people aligning with stereotypes to prove them right or wrong? Yeah, that is a good question. So typically, how this is done is by recruiting a lot of participants. So 400 participants is a really good number. And also by taking samples throughout the day, especially when participants are not told when the samples are being taken, uh, this can also reduce a lot of that because it's very difficult for participants to actively game the system over a period of 8 to 12 hours or 24 hours. It's really easy to do this if you have like 1 to 2 hours of focus and you know you're being recorded the entire time. But if I say, okay, I'm going to give you this for 12 hours, and every hour I'm just going to randomly record 5 minutes of it, uh, you have to play that game to bias that recording for that whole 12 hours, and you don't know when those 5 minutes are coming up. So if you want to be that man who talks constantly, you've got to talk for 12 hours. Like it's um and you're just one participant out of 186 men. So that one little anomaly isn't really going to skew the data that heavily in one direction. So the way that this experiment was set up was enough to mitigate that sort of influence. I'm sure if this was done again, you'd probably find very similar results. And the key difference is that, you know, there was a lot of variation for each individual person, but then when you put them all together and you separate by gender, it's like, oh look, there's no difference. It's just two big circles with a lot of different dots all over the place. Could the per day average change depending on the time period? Maybe. Maybe. With enough people and with enough samples, though, it's likely going to be the same. I mean, if they really wanted the best results, sure, they could like double the number of participants. And if they really wanted to put a wrench in this, taking samples of non-binary participants too would also be great, because then they could say for sure this is not a gender thing. 19th century versus 20th century, 21st century. I don't know if that would make much of a difference. I think what you'd see there is perhaps the emergence of technology, so how people communicate. So maybe we'd see less words spoken now, and we'd see more text. Maybe that's the difference we would see. Maybe we would see preferred modes of communication. So having a survey that says, you know, how do you talk to people now, would be a way that we could tell more of a difference. So instead of saying, well, who talks more, it would be more like, well, who speaks more versus who texts more. That would be more of what the study looks at in modern times. At least if you found a difference between men and women now, um, that would be sort of the question. Is like, well, is this really a difference between men and women who talks more, or is this a question of men and women uh, who uses a certain medium more, and did you actually choose a representative sample of participants? And yeah, taking the same participants over a period of time would also be a really good way to test this out. But again, gender differences, if we're just taking a look at how many words people speak in general, there's no differences between men and women. People just talk as much as they want to talk. It's all up to you. Here's another thing that's interesting. So um, this could relate to standard speech, and that's that women tend to use more of these types of patterns in speech. So hedge statements with tag questions. So okay, hedge statements with tag questions. We haven't talked about what these are. These are sort of polite ways of what's the word? Skirting around the issues of going around the issue. So when you say words like "isn't it" or "didn't she," and you put like a question at the end, didn't she? These are example of tag questions, like it's nice out, isn't it? She did great, didn't she? These are examples of tag questions. So they're called tag questions because they just sort of tag on to the end and you look for agreement. Intonations associated with surprise and politeness. So back channels, yes, aha. So these are just like words of agreement. Um, Sort of these filler words like and what's more interesting, words like diversified vocabulary. So I'm incredibly guilty of this. In terms of color words in English, I am familiar with about 12 to 14. The colors of the rainbow, aqua, teal, maroon, and that is about it. Uh, while it's been shown that women have a tendency to be able to name a lot more colors. So I learned some color words while I was looking for the slides. So words like mauve, I have no idea what this color is, but I learned the word for it. Ultramarine, there you go. Um, I've forgotten the other words of the color words I've learned. Periwinkle, periwinkle, that's a color word I've recognized. Thank you. Um, so more color words than men tend to know. Crimson, crimson. Oh, that's another word I know from video games. Azure, that's another word I've heard in a video game title before. Sunset. Women also see more shades of colors, I think. Okay, that's an interesting thing. So actually, if you can name more colors, you can actually perceive shades of colors better. That is a cultural fact. Um, talk about that a little. Actually, no, I removed that. That was from the very first week of the course. Talked about it a little bit with the Russians. If you have different words for light blue and dark blue, you're faster at discriminating them. So if you know more color words and you can identify them faster. And you can also perceive them better. So when people ask me the difference between violet and purple, I have no idea because I don't know what violet and purple are separately in my head. But people who know purple and violet differently, they're better. You know, might blow your mind. I'm not. I can also see a full range of colors, yet I don't know the difference. So again, these are tendencies. These are not true of all women, of course, just tendencies. So thank you for help with some extra colors. Okay, but of course, with all this stuff, again, it's not just about gender. There's so much more that makes up your identity and how you use language and all these different things. So between conversation style, between the pitch that you use, between your back channels, your hedges, your tag questions, the word choices you have, whether you use standard forms or non-standard forms, it's not just about your gender. It's about age, profession, cultural identity, your nationality, what your first language was, what your parents say, who your friend groups, who your friends are. Your friends have massive influence on you. When you're growing up as a kid, between age of like 5 and 12, your friends have a much greater influence on your language than your parents do because you're learning from your peers. And all of the things that you've seen so far, you can consciously choose to change and you can exploit them. So if you are a cisgender woman, you can take the language tendencies of, stereotypical men and you can use them and you can modify your identity if you want, or you could pick them up and you can change the way that people perceive you. You can exploit them. So uh, you can modify the way that you talk to change how people perceive you. And you can even change how you perceive yourself. Um, so It's a rather incredible fact about language. It's gender identity is not something that's straightforward. Identity is not something that's straightforward. So I don't say this lightly. Just do what you want with language. But if you feel like you want to explore, you can explore using different language. You can explore using different conversation styles, and you can see how you feel about it. Um, so I don't really have much else to say about that, but yeah, you can challenge your own gender identity by using different language. Now, let's talk about the other side of gender and language, which is about the words in the language themselves and not about the people. So, sexist language. Now, every language has sexist language. And what we mean by sexist language is it's any words that like discriminate based on gender. So, what this means is like we have all these people, and if there's some words that basically say, okay, we're going to cut you off and treat you as a different class of people based on a certain word, then we say that language is sexist. So basically, we don't want to be cutting this person off and saying they're a lower class. Otherwise, it's sexist language. So based on like gender. So whether this is masculine, feminine, non-binary, or whatever. Typically, sexist language does not target men. I mean, by definition, sexist language does not target men. So let's start with sexist masculines. So sexist masculines, sorry, not sexist masculines, generic masculines. The words he and man. So he is a pronoun, um, and man is like the word man, but I'm not talking about the word man. I'm talking about the morpheme man. So this is the morpheme used in a word like mankind, or like man has stepped foot on the moon to refer to like person. So this is the man that just means person. And these are quote unquote generic. So these are supposed to refer to men and women. We also have generic pronouns too. So a generic pronoun is a word like one or they. And these are actually truly generic because one and they can refer to men or women, and they're actually perceived as men or women. The problem with these generic masculines like he and man is that they're actually processed in the brain, usually as referring specifically to men. So uh, if you read the sentence, man needs food to survive, the understanding is that very specifically this is male at first. You might read it again and understand this as being any person, but the initial interpretation is that this is male. Um, Even if you say a political man or a male man or a fireman, this man here, even though it would be intended to be generic, you'll still refer to this or think of this as a male initially. So, although we say it's a generic masculine, generic meaning male or female, really it's interpreted as being male. And we can do this with processing studies online. So, if we did political man, and we gave it the word she in a gender mismatch study, we would get all those processing and rating effects like we did before. So we could use psycholinguistic studies to prove this, and that is what has been done. We could also do the brain studies with the ERPs to get P600 effects or N400 effects. I mean, with gender mismatch, you can actually get both. But we would get P600 effects with political man and she because we're saying, hold on a second, these don't match. So in the brain, these are different. Uh, so are there any questions so far? Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break, and when we come back, we'll talk about generic they. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Sometimes I wish the audio was much better on those. You could actually listen to how they spoke back then. I noticed that the kids in that Keds commercial, if you listen to them, they didn't pronounce the R's in the words. Interesting. Anyways, back to some generic talk. So let's talk about generic they. So back to singular they. Because singular they has been around for a long time. I mean, very long time, like 500 years long time. So right now, depending on the type of antecedent used, there is almost as popular as generic he or the his/her. So what I notice is when I read a lot of your assignments, especially from those of you who have learned English as a second language, I get sentences like every student should hand in his/her assignment. And this makes sense because this is a prescriptive rule for writing. And in the 18th century, 19th century, it was written in grammar books that this is what you should write. You should use he as a generic pronoun. So you should say every student should hand in his assignment. This is really what was said, and then we've changed it to his or her. But actually, what a lot of people say, and what is now encouraged in writing, like as of 2021, 2020, is to write every student should hand in their assignment. So to use gender neutral words instead. So even though there is often interpreted as plural, we can still use it as a singular in this case to refer to student. So this is an acceptable alternative. And this has been used in Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's Hamlet has this example. 'Tis meet that some more audience than a mother, since nature makes them partial. So them is referring to some. Now, even though some might refer to a group of people, some, the word itself is singular. So them can refer to the singular word some. Sorry, what am I talking about? Some is not, some are here, some is here. Some is here, some are here. Them is some is, never mind. That example, more audience than a mother. An audience is here. So the word should not be on some, the word should be on audience. This one should be on audience. I have confused myself. Them should be on audience. But the word audience is singular. So an audience is here rather than an audience are here. So them and audience is acceptable. The Lord Chesterfield example is a much better example because person is very clearly singular. So if a person is born of a gloomy temper, they cannot help it. So this is a much better example of a modern sentence where you have a very clear singular antecedent, person, and you have a gender neutral they referring to it. So if a person is born of a gloomy temper, they cannot help it. Now, this was in 1759 using singular they. So it's always humorous when the argument is that singular they is destroying English grammar. This is something that has never been acceptable in the history of English, and this is something that, if we allow, will make children much stupider. Well, what are you talking about? This is something that's been around in English for hundreds of years, and actually prescriptivists are the ones who said in the late 1700s, early 1900s that it's not okay. So it was okay. Grammar rules then said it wasn't okay, and now we're going back to how it was in the past. So singular they has been around for a long time. So what we notice too in language, so we have these ungendered terms that we can use, and this is what we're trying to do now with language, but we still have these gendered pairs. So words like prince and princess and hero and heroine, sorry, hero and heroine, should make sure I pronounce that very clearly, um, where you have what's called a marked form and an unmarked form. So the unmarked form, prince, basically just means that there's nothing part of the word that signals gender. So the masculine form is unmarked, while the feminine form is marked. Now, what we mean by marked is that it has like this extra morpheme that tells you what the gender is. So this is the marked form because it tells you that it's feminine. So prince and princess, or hero and heroine. So this tells you that it's feminine. So there's a lot of words that have this, of course, like uh, waiter and then waitress. So it doesn't look like waitress might have the same uh, form, but I mean, really, it's just waiter s, but then they just remove the e from it for pronunciation purposes to get waitress. So that's the ess suffix. But that's another mark. Some of the pairs don't necessarily mean a difference between masculine and feminine. Sometimes it's just a different meaning completely, like Mr. and Mistress. Um, Mr. is like a title of a person. Mistress is not just the title of a person. Same with governor and governess. Governor runs a country. Governess, I believe a governess is someone who takes care of children. Uh, I don't know for sure. It's a word that is never really used. Um, Often the feminine terms will have negative connotations as well. So bachelor and spinster, again, this is an ancient term that's not really used too often. I shouldn't say ancient term, it's not that old. The really like bachelorette is used more commonly. Bachelorette to be the feminine counterpart, but I mean, spinster was a term that was used. So historically, negative connotation. And by historically, I mean like 20 years ago. What's interesting too is that you can take these words like nurse that have stereotypes and you can just use the other gender, like male or lady or female, and you can make it a compound like male nurse or lady doctor or male ballerina. So it seems that feminine terms get a negative connotation, then new terms have to be crafted. Yeah. So this is one of these cases where the culture has been reflected in a lot of the vocabulary in the past. So now what we've noticed, well, it's not what we've noticed, but if you've seen how language is changing, like words like waiter and waitress are now phasing out of existence. So we don't often see people use these terms anymore, especially younger ones. Usually we just call all of these people servers or wait staff. So we don't see waiter and waitress used too often. I mean, it depends on your circle of friends, of course. Some circles of friends will still use those words, and if you're older, you'll probably still use those words, but younger people will just use server. Hero and heroine, uh, just call everyone heroes usually, or main characters, or uh, warriors, or whatever I don't know, protagonist. So we'll use different words. In fact, this is how language is changing because we want to change our language to reflect society. And sometimes it's forced. And usually when it's forced, there's a lot of pushback and it doesn't go over well. Um, but a lot of the language change is just natural and people accept it when it's a slow change. So if you do a few words at a time, so for instance, you just change a word like in a job description, you say, we're not hiring waitresses, we're hiring servers, or we're hiring wait staff. And people get used to it and that changes slowly. Um, Instead of saying mankind, you say humankind. You know, people don't really resist that. Um, Sometimes you say things like people kind, and then people sort of look at you and you say, well, why would you say that when we have the word humankind? And then there's a little pushback, right? Because you're sort of hypercorrecting in that sense as well. So here's some examples of things that have been changed. And these all have examples of the word man in them. So, like, man has changed to either human or people, mankind to humankind, or just people in general. You know, with mankind, there's no reason to keep the word kind there. You can just keep the word people. That's fine. Manpower has changed to personnel or workforce or just force themselves. Chairman to chairperson. It's a lot of the case when man is like telling you what the job is or what the worker is, you just change it to worker or person. So fireman to firefighter, mailman to post worker or mail person. Now, uh, one thing to sort of keep in mind and to think about, and this will vary from person to person, and this is a change or this is a change that you know everyone sort of has to collectively think about and make or not. When you see words with the man morpheme. Is the man morpheme in every word? Is it man, like a male person, or is it just the sound man? So, in a word like craftsmanship or snowman or penmanship, do these all evoke the meaning of man with gender, or is it just some of these words? Because a lot of them do, but not every one of these might. So this isn't me making a decision. This isn't you individually making a decision. These are decisions made by society. And these aren't conscious decisions that will be made. In some situations, they will be. A lot of these will just be subconscious decisions that will be made over time as language changes naturally. So you can think about it like snowman. I mean, when you think about the construction of a person, yeah, this is a much more uh, this represents a person much more than something like, I don't know, say penmanship or craftsmanship. Yeah, you evoke the idea of a man much more than something like penmanship, because something like crafts and trades are very tightly associated with men, and that's maybe a stereotype we want to get rid of. I guess in regards to man, to snowman as a kid, I had people around me change it to snow woman, including myself. Yeah, like that's something you see too, snow woman, snowman. But we also want to take into the fact that we have more than two genders now. So, um, could we look at the etymology to see if it's actually man or not? Well, that's a good question too, right? Um, and we could take a look to see if it evolved from another word with man. But then the question is, does that really matter? Is it the etymology that matters to people, or is it how it makes people feel? What's going to drive language change? Is it based on fact and the history of the word, or does it matter about how people feel in the modern era when people use the language? So these are all different decisions that are going to influence how language changes. Yeah, so the person who wrote for a group could have been a man, so a pen man, but that has changed since then. Yeah, so like what's a pen man in the modern era? Pen man isn't really a word. A craftsman is still something that exists, but a penman, when's the last time you've seen a job listing for a penman, right? So like penman has sort of lost its meaning. Uh, Penmanship or pensmanship. The man meaning in that might not be as relevant or important to people as something like craftsman or snowman. So that word itself might not be significant for change. But again, it's not for us to decide, it's for the people that it matters to. Now, there is one case study, and this is really interesting, of a language that introduced a gender neutral pronoun, a language that didn't have one. So this is different from English because English has always had singular they that we could use. We've just reintroduced it. But Sweden didn't have one. Sweden had a male and a female pronoun. And Sweden is not a gendered language. They just have it for pronouns. So since about 2007, 2008, I believe, people have tried to use this pronoun hen. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it completely correctly. I'm just looking at how it's spelled here. So hen, if anyone knows the actual pronunciation, I'm sorry. So they introduced this formally in 2012. And what I mean by formally, I mean it was like added to dictionaries as like a gender neutral pronoun, as you can refer to other people with hen. So like I know hen, meaning I know them. And there was a study to see how people felt about the pronoun from 2012 to 2015, because you're introducing a new word and it's about gender identity and gender neutrality. So of course, people are going to take issue with it. So in 2012, over half the participants felt negatively about it. They did not want this gender neutral pronoun. 3 years later, that reduced to only 10% of participants feeling negative about it. So 3 years, huge reduction in attitude, negative attitude. But despite that reduction in attitude, people did not use it more. So even though it was introduced and is allowed to be used according to a dictionary, and people don't mind it anymore, people do not use it more often. So it could be the same thing with singular they as time goes on in English. So its usage might not increase over time, but it's very likely that people will accept it more and more as time progresses, just because people get used to it. It's just about exposure. That's what it is. The more people hear it, the more it's used in daily life, the more people accept it. Now, what's really interesting, and I just bring this up just because it has been studied, and it correlates a lot with what has happened in the past 5 years with the movement. Someone did a follow-up study to see, well, hold on a second. For all the people who said that they didn't like this, was there any sort of personality or expressions that correlated with the people who didn't like it? And here are some of the things associated with the people who didn't like it. And again, this isn't all the people who didn't like it. These are just correlations. So this is the tendencies of the people who didn't like the gender neutral pronoun. They tended to be older. They tended to self-identify as right wing. They tended to give sexist responses to other questions on the survey because it wasn't just about gender neutral pronouns. It was about sexism in general. They gave comments saying that binary sexism is acceptable. Change is too difficult. So these were people that were generally, based on the last two responses, these were people that, were generally sexist. So they didn't like gender neutral hen because they were sexist. Then the other two responses were just like more political and age facts. So they right-wing older people. So this is all done in Sweden, so it's not necessarily the right wing that you would expect from maybe the US, which is probably what you're thinking about. This is Sweden, so different aspects of right wing. Binary sexism being male, female. So not including transgender. not including transgender and not including non-binary. So yeah, the quote is from participants. So the quote is a direct response from participants. So they said binary sexism is acceptable. So that participant is insisting that there's only male and female. Yeah. So these are the types of people who are saying, I don't like gender neutral pronoun hen in Sweden. One thing I do want to add to this is that even though gender neutral hen is accepted in Sweden now, style guides for academic writing still say do not use it. So even though it's accepted in the language, it still is not okay for academic writing. So it still hasn't been widely accepted for all purposes of communication. That's still sort of what singular they is in right now. So APA accepts it, Chicago accepts it, but there are still some style guides that are not fully okay with singular they at this point. So yeah, this is the process of what English is going through at this point. So we saw it with Sweden about 10 years ago, and we're seeing this in English. So a lot of studies are being done right now in linguistics with singular they. So are there any questions about this before we talk about culture and thought? Okay, here's something I found really, really interesting. What do you call your neighbor's wife? Well, you type neighbor's wife into Google, you get about 211,000 results. Type neighbor's husband into Google, you get like way less. Um, yeah, like interesting thing. So why is this even relevant? Why is this slide relevant? Well, different different languages have different terms for different people. So English, aunt and uncle, doesn't matter. Father's side, mother's side, sister, brother. There's no distinction for different words for older sister, older brother, younger sister, younger brother. Different languages have different terms. So some languages would actually have, well, maybe not terms for neighbor's wife and neighbor's husband, but they could. There's also a little bit of uh, sexism here for a little bias in the search results. Anyways, here's the big question. Does language determine thought? And if we just think about the sexism in language that we talked about, if you were to say something like, uh, every student handed in his assignment on time. So I'll put the sentence up, that way we have a reference. Every student handed his assignment in on time. Now, uh, if we think of students as male in our heads all the time, just because we hear the word his or he in sentences, then language is going to determine thought. Now, what I mean by this is because we hear this in speech all the time. So if we hear every student handed his assignment in, and we hear this 100 times, and now in our head, we always think student is male. Yeah, then language determines thought. But this isn't really what happens. We still know student can be male or female or non-binary or whatever. So language isn't really determining thought. But if we're hearing he and we're using he because historically students were male, or maybe it's just a convention due to historical reasons, then language is reflecting the culture, and the culture is having an influence on our language. And this is really what's happening. Uh, Culture has an incredible influence on language, and language is influencing how we think. It's not determining how we think, but it influences how we think. So, I mean, does it matter? Does it matter that language influences how we think? Does it matter if there's a difference between language determining how we think and how it influences how we think? Uh, yeah, kind of. It kind of matters, because if language influences how we think, we should probably construct our culture and our language around how we want to think and how we want to act. So, um, if we don't want to use sexist language, so if we don't want to have sexist thoughts and we don't want to be living in a sexist society, then we should probably get rid of sexist language and vice versa. Of course, it's not causing each direction, but reducing sexist language can reduce a sexist culture. It can influence both ways. So here's a really interesting study on hurricanes. Sorry, the transition just made me laugh when I said that. But this relates to sexism in language and thought. Imagine a hurricane is coming. It turns out that the name of a hurricane, whether it's a male name or a female name, can actually influence how dangerous people interpret the hurricane to be. So, if a hurricane has a female name, people think that the hurricane is going to be less dangerous than a hurricane with a male name. Now, isn't that just the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your life? That the name of a hurricane can influence how dangerous people think that the hurricane is going to be. So this is called linguistic relativity. Uh, so linguistic relativity says that language affects how people conceptualize their world. So if people have sexism in their head and they believe that men are more dangerous, so here, if you believe that men are more dangerous than women, then you'll believe male hurricanes are more dangerous than female hurricanes. But what the hell is a female hurricane? That's my question, because this is just the most absurd thing I've ever read. So here's the quote that scares me. Our model suggests that changing a severe hurricane's name from Charlie, I don't know how to pronounce this name, to Eloise, could nearly triple its death toll. So to go from male to female could triple the amount of deaths from a hurricane. Yeah, people imagining a female hurricane were not as willing to seek shelter. So if it's a male hurricane, yeah, people are gonna take it seriously. If it's a female hurricane, people are just like, it won't be as bad. It's not gonna be as aggressive. I mean, it's just stupid. But this is a fact of the world. This is sexism and language and the brain all coming together. This is survival of the fittest in action. This is the Darwin Awards. It's Yeah. Aren't most hurricanes given female names? Aren't Yeah. I mean, they are, right? I think most of them, like some of the most damaging ones, like Hurricane Katrina, right? It's it's just, I don't know. Yeah, I mean they have codes, but they're usually advertised in the news. So this is a nice example of linguistic relativity. If a hurricane has a female name, they're not going to take it as seriously. So that's just some stupid real world facts. Uh, Here's some language, culture, and thought related to kinship terms. So not thinking about the stupidity of fellow humans. Just some differences across languages with how we think about relatives. So many of you probably speak second languages and you have different words for your relatives. And if we think about English, whether you have an aunt or uncle on your mother's or father's side, we just call them aunt or uncles. This looks at Bosnian. So on the right side, we have uh, brother and sister of uncle. Sorry, brother and sister of your father. So this would be the brother of the father. This would be the sister of the father. On the left side, we have the sister of the mother. On the left side, we have the brother of the mother. And depending if you have your father's brother or mother's brother, you use different words to refer to like the aunt or uncle relationship. So the uncle and aunt on your mother's side will have different words than the uncle and aunt on your father's side. And it will also depend on whether uh, it's the sister that's blood related or the brother that is blood related. And there's actually a little bit not necessarily sexism here, but there's a little bit of gender discrimination with the terms here too, because you have tetka for meaning the sister, whether it's your mother's sister or your father's sister. But when you talk about the brother of your father or the brother of your mother, you get different terms. So a bit of interesting fact about the terms used in Bosnian. And you'll see many different languages have this. So for instance, Japanese makes a distinction between the terms older brother and younger brother. English just has brother, and then we modify it with an adjective, older or younger. But Japanese uses actual different words for older brother and younger brother. It's not just brother with a modifier, they're actually separate words. Many languages do this. Uh, Even with grandmother in English, we just take mother and we modify it. Mother, grandmother, great grandmother. We don't really have many familial terms in English, but many languages have a lot more than we do. Here's another example with Punjabi. So a lot more. I won't go into detail about all of these here, but if you want to take a look, uh, this this goes as far as like your daughter's kids and your mother or father-in-law and so on. So there's a lot going on here. Here's an interesting, oh, let me move me out of the way. Here's an interesting one with language influencing how we think. This one is talked about in psychology a lot. Yeah. This one is really, really fun. You can influence how people think and how people respond to questions just by choosing the words that you ask them questions with. So this is a pretty famous study. It's so famous that it's in intro psych books. Uh, and it's also perfectly ethical, which is incredible because who puts ethical studies in an intro psych course? Uh, so participants watched a video about a traffic accident. And there's a few things happened in the video. And following the video, they were asked some questions. And each person was asked different questions. So depending on how the participants were asked questions, they gave different answers. So they were asked a question about speed. So the speed question had two different variants. So one question was, how fast were the cars going when they hit? While another version of the question was, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Now, which question do you think resulted in a higher speed for participants responding? Hit or smashed into each other. Well, hit is very like, it could be light, it could be fast, who knows? But when you see smashed, smashed is very high impact. So the participants who read question 1B reported a higher speed overall. So no matter what the speed was shown in the video, they reported a higher speed on average if they were asked question 1B instead of 1A. Here's another type of question they were asked in the video. Did you see a broken headlight versus did you see the broken headlight? And they just had to say yes or no. Now, which question do you think resulted in more yeses? A broken headlight or the broken headlight? Uh, Now, in this one, for 2B, they said more yeses. So with the word the, when you say the word the, I'm going to type this out, the implies existence. If I say something like, I saw, oh, actually, no, this is like a real story, actually. I don't know if you know this, because I just went up to SFU like 5 days ago, but they have, and if you go up at the top of the AQ, you can see the new unicorn statue. It's at the top of the AQ, but the new unicorn statue, yeah, yeah, the unicorn statue, it's there. Oh, because I said the word the, I'm implying that it exists. It'd be weird to say the and not imply that it exists. The just implies existence. There's no unicorn statue. But because I said the, I'm immediately saying that it's there. That's what the human brain interprets. So even though in the video itself, there was no broken headlight, because the question said, did you see the broken headlight? Participants said, oh, I must have missed it. But you said the, so yeah, it's there. So you can manipulate what people think in their memory by just changing some words, manipulating the words in the questions. So, I mean, this is just a greater discussion about eyewitness testimony overall. That is mainly more for a psychology course than a linguistics course. Um, but yeah, you can manipulate what people think by choosing very specific words in your questions. And the is a very powerful word. Okay, any other questions about language and thought before we move on to accents and uh, dialects? Dialects. Okay, so accents are exactly how we talk about accents in casual conversation. They're how we pronounce words. So whether you say either or either, so this is either, this is either, or new or new. New, it's new, new or new. Economics, economics, or economics. Uh, how you pronounce it, I mean, a lot of this is individual variation, but there are some groups of people who are very consistent with how they pronounce it. So everyone has their own accent. Dialects encompass a lot more. So it's how you pronounce words, the sentence structure that you have. So you might have individual or might have specific things you do. Like for instance, Texas English has double modals, like might, could. Canadian English has I'm done my homework. Um, word choice is a big thing. So here on the right, I have a map of whether people say soda, pop, Coke, or soft drink to refer to all sparkling beverages. So we are in pop territory in Canada, at least in Western Canada. Pop territory ends about here. If you go down into the land of California, there start to be soda people. When you go to this weird area, they start to call everything Coke. And when you get into Yellow Land, which is barely on the map, they just call everything soft drinks, and it's good that they're barely there because that's way too formal for me. Now, an idiolect, the last thing, this might be a word you haven't heard. This is about the individual characteristics of a speaker. So this is more like about you specifically. So your idiolect and what makes you specifically unique. So we won't really talk about idiolects. We'll just talk about accents and dialects. This thing on the right, we'll see this term again, but this is called an isogloss. So this is a map that tells you where certain patterns are and where the boundaries between patterns are. So you can see where in a map certain things are pronounced in certain ways. So it can be words, it can be vowels, it can be syntactic patterns, and so on. Any linguistic feature you want, you can map with an isogloss. There are tons of these online. People love making these, and they're always interesting. So dialects are sometimes problematic. We'll talk about why. So linguistically, a dialect is just a variety of a language that is spoken by like two different social or geographic groups. Usually it's geographic. So people that cluster together usually speak in a certain way. Now, the only criteria for a dialect is that they're mutually intelligible. This means that they understand each other. If they can understand each other completely, like, I mean, like over 90% of what they say, then they're dialects of the same language. If they do not understand each other linguistically, they're not dialects of the same language, they're different languages. So that's what we need to know about dialects linguistically. The problem is in the real world, things are not that simple because due to political reasons or cultural reasons or religious reasons, languages and dialects are not determined this way. One of the big things, so two examples, and these two examples are always things that get linguists into trouble. But we'll talk about them for linguistic purposes. First thing is talking about this thing called the Chinese language. To linguists, it's a little weird to say the Chinese language because Chinese isn't really a language. It's a bunch of different languages. So linguistically, Mandarin and Cantonese are two completely separate languages. Someone who speaks Mandarin and someone who speaks Cantonese cannot understand each other because the languages are very, very different. So linguistically, they're different languages. However, due to political and geographic reasons, they are considered different dialects of the Chinese language. So people in China consider them to be dialects of Chinese, even though they are mutually unintelligible. So linguistically, they're different languages, but in the real world, for political reasons and geographic reasons, they're considered different dialects of Chinese. On the flip side, we have another case where we have sort of the opposite thing, like Hindi and Urdu. So sorry, this should be uh, Hindi and Urdu. These are mutually intelligible. Speakers of Hindi and Urdu can understand each other completely. So really, they are different dialects of the same language, but they are considered to be different languages. But because they can understand each other linguistically, we would say they're different dialects. It's the same thing with Dutch and Swiss German. So Dutch and Swiss German are considered to be different languages, but they can understand each other almost perfectly. So they should be different dialects of the same language. With Hindi and Urdu, I'm not quite sure why they're considered different languages. I'm guessing it's for religious or political reasons. It might also be for a reason with the writing systems. In some cases, it's because of the writing system. I think another factor with China, for example, or sorry, with Chinese, for example, is that Mandarin and Cantonese both use the same writing system, which is another reason why they call it the Chinese language, because they consider the writing system to be sort of like the language, and that it's just the pronunciations of the writing system that are different. So that's another factor that goes into play. While Hindi and Urdu, uh, Hindi writing system, a Hindi writing system, and the Urdu writing system. I don't know if they're the same or not. I can't remember off the top of my head, but sometimes the writing systems are also a factor of that. So it's usually not just one factor. I'm not trying to simplify it and say it's one factor. There's a lot of complicated things going on behind the scenes for these. So linguistic definition is just, are they mutually intelligible? But the real world complicates things a lot more. So there can be many different dialects of a language. It doesn't just have to be 2 or 3. There can be 5, 10, 15. English has so many different dialects. So even in the United States, there are 15, 20, 25, 30 different dialects. That's not including like British English, Canadian English, Australian English, and so on. So as you separate more in the world, you get different variations. So here I'm just focusing on different vocabulary differences. So I just pulled some different dialects out, like New England English. So this is around New Hampshire and Vermont. A grinder for sub sandwich, or a tag sale for garage sale. Southern Texas English has the word fixin' to for about to. If you want to know where the word finna came from, it came from the word fixin' to. Using the word plum instead of absolutely. Like, I'm absolutely gonna do that. I'm plumb gonna do that. Like, that's whatever. Southern Texas is weird. Uh, caps for popcorn. Dope for soda. Yo, let's go to the movie theater and get some caps and dope. Like, that's Appalachian English for you. Sounds pretty cool. Calling a groundhog a whistle pig. I mean, listen, if you want to sound like Appalachian English, I got some cool words. So some vocabulary differences. Here's a couple more. So running shoes in South African English. So this is beyond United States, called tackies or techies. In New Zealand, they call coolers a chili bin. Australian, they call a sidewalk a footpath. And in South African, a traffic light is called a robot. And of course, Australian English, you probably heard too. The parking lot is called a car park. So while you go shopping and your cars are bored, they can go play at the playground in the car park. Yeah, loo for the toilet. So toilet, loo in the UK. Servo is a gas station. I believe afternoon in Australian English is called the Arvo as well. See you in the Arvo. That's a different one. And then one more slide with a few more words. I mean, you can find these everywhere, but here's a lot more. There's car park there, underground, uh, tights. In Canadian English, it's called pantyhose in American English. So as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between Canadian English and American English. What I learned is that in American English, on the list actually was calling a faucet a tap. My American friends had no idea what that was, and that like blew my mind. Um, so yeah, why don't we take a 10-minute break, come back and finish up. If you have any questions, type them in chat. I'll try to answer. I was private messaged earlier, but that person has left. So anyways, I'll see you in 10 minutes and we'll finish up then.
Full Metal Alchemist. Full Metal Alchemist.
Tickle, 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 tickle.
Remember that beat by. Hey, what the fuck, man? Come on.
You are not a gentle boy. Kind of are.
¿Puedes hacerme un sándwich? That means, can you make me a sandwich in
But you're just a pretty princess. Come here.
You try getting down here, sucker. Try being my...
Yes.
There is no such
Hey! You can't park there.
Look at this idiot.
I looked at a tree the other day, like really looked at a tree.
At a tree?
Yeah.
What does the tree do?
Nothing, it was a tree.
Yeah, but the rear view mirror. Yes.
Yo, this dude was rocking on my hat the whole time. Yo.
Steal this for me? I mean, oh, this?
Who thinks Watson is too heavy? Raise your hand if you think he's too heavy. Does anybody think he's too skinny? No. Okay. So I'm very proud of you guys. You got 100%. He's perfect.
What the fuck?
I hate to admit it, but I'm honestly terrified of spiders.
What's brown and sticky? Stick.
Okay. So here is another isogloss. But this isogloss takes a look at phonological differences. So differences in pronunciation. So this one specifically looks at something called the cot-quat merger. So in the United States, some people pronounce the vowels in cot and quat differently, and I'm trying my best to pronounce them differently. So cot and quat. But in Canada and a lot of places in the US, they're pronounced the same. So cot and cot, cot, versus cot and quat. So this map tells you where people pronounce them the same and where people pronounce them differently. So the red dots are similar and the blue dots are different. So we can see that in the Western United States, Western and Central, so around this is about the boundary where it shifts from being the same to different. And there's this little group of merged people in these two areas, but usually in the Eastern United States, cot and quat are different, while in the Western United States, cot and quat are the same. So many different vowels. You can check them out. In Australia, they have something called the pin and pen merger. This is where the vowels I and E are the same. So they say pin. Can I get a pin? And you don't know if that's pen or pin because they're pronounced very similar. You can imagine what issues arise whenever they say the word deck. What are they saying in Australian? You have to be pretty good at context to figure it out. But it's not just words that we can figure out with isoglosses, it's also sounds that we can map with isoglosses. here's something very specific that Canadians do. And because I'm here, I can demonstrate this because I have this. But if you are looking just at the slides, you can always check out the audio files above. This is called Canadian raising. So this is when we take two vowels, I and ow, and we raise them in our mouth when it's followed by a voiceless consonant. So I'm just going to demonstrate these with words so you can hear a difference. So I'm going to pick the word so I'm going to transcribe it first, and then I'm going to say it after. So this should be this sound, but because I'm Canadian, I change it when I pronounce it. So eyes versus ice, ice, I, eyes, ice, I. So there's a difference in how Canadians pronounce it depending on whether that last sound is voiced eyes or voiceless ice. Now, is a very similar pronunciation, and Americans will pronounce them exactly the same. They will say eyes and ice, ice, eyes, ice. They will say them exactly the same. But it's very difficult if you're Canadian born to pronounce them the same because it's part of your phonology. You'll hear the difference here too. House, house versus to house. House, house. House, house. Ow, ow. Ow, ow. Or loud, out. Owed, out. Ow, ow. Or bribe versus pipe. Bribe, pipe. Ibe, pipe. Pipe. So it might be a little bit difficult to hear it if you're not used to it, but Canadians do have raising with those two particular vowels, and we know precisely where those happen. So for instance, B here is voiced, and the P here is voiceless. So that's why we see the change before the P. Same thing with the D and the T, and the Z and the S. So Canadians make that vowel change specifically with I and ow. So interesting Canadianism. Yeah, wait, they're supposed to be the same. It's not they're supposed to be the same. It's that everywhere else in the world they're the same. Canadians pronounce them differently. Like, oh yeah, I'll come to your house later. I'll come to your house later. Oh, that's weird, isn't it? Or do you have some ice for that? Do you have some ice for that? That's weird too. Is that what the about is about? Well, it's actually about. Yeah, it's raising there too. About, a raising, about. It should be about, but we say about because we raise. And then Americans hear it as like a boot or about, because they hear it as higher than we hear it because we're used to it. They're not. So here's some questions about you. I don't have a survey set up for this, but that's nothing. That's some quick. Never mind. I can't. The Zoom site is down on my end, so I can't even make the poll. Well, that sucks. We can just do some numbers here. There's 1, 2. There's 3, 4. There's 5, 6. There's 7, 8. Tell me, for each of these, which ones do you say? Do you say 1 or 2? Do you say 3 or 4? Do you say 5 or 6? Or do you 7 or 8? So 1 and 2 is go to the hospital or go to hospital. Would you say, have you any tea? Or would you say, do you have any tea? Would you say, I can't stop him from leaving? Or would you say, I can't stop him leaving? Or would you say, when I'm done my homework, or when I'm done doing my homework? So most people here are go to the hospital people. Most people are not British for do you have any tea? Most people are from people. I can't stop him from leaving. And most of you are also Canadian. So when I'm done my homework, at least with Canadian grammar. Okay, so there's a few hidden British isms here. So go to hospital. This is British English. Have you any tea is also British English. I can't stop him leaving. Once again, British English. When I'm done my homework, this is Canadian English. And when I'm done doing my homework is American English. So here's an interesting fact about American English. Uh, in American English, this sentence, when I'm done my homework, is ungrammatical. It's ungrammatical to Americans because you just cannot say done my homework. You have to say done something to your homework. You have to use another verb there. You need a verb in this position. Or you have to say I'm done with my homework. You need something there. You cannot just say done my homework. You can't say done the dishes. Done is not a verb of completion in that case. It needs more. Americans need something there. So this is another Canadian construction that Canadians have. Just like Canadian raising and phonology, this is a Canadian syntactic construction. So a little interesting fact about Canadian English there too. I shouldn't just say just Canadian English. There are probably other places in the world that can do it, but this is a specific contrast between Canadian English and going down to Seattle, where they'll be like, excuse you, what did you just say? Would you like to finish your sentence? Say it again properly. There, Canadian. So just another dialectal difference. Okay, so over time, things change. Next slide. I'm kidding. But basically, this is what the slide is saying. Over time, things change. And what sociolinguists care about is how things change, how the community expresses variation at a specific point in time. So let's say you have all these different people. What is this group doing at a particular time? What is this group doing at a particular time? How do all of these different people feel? Now, in a person's lifetime, there's usually a lot of changes with vocabulary, but the grammar does not change much. So when we see something like singular they come in with a pronoun is part of someone's grammar. So we're not going to see a big adjustment throughout one lifetime. This is a generational change that's going to happen. So by the end of my life, sure, I'll see the grandkids and the younger generation adapt it. But people older than me, they're not going to make much change. It's going to be very difficult because function words in the brain are hardwired and pronouns are function words. So it's not just a social thing that's difficult. It's also a brain thing that makes it very difficult. And that's something that I think a lot of people just don't understand because a lot of people aren't linguistically trained. And that's, that's fine. But there's also not a lot of grammar changes that happens. So what we have to do as sociolinguists, if you do analyze language, is you take a look over time between old and young speakers. Not only, of course, like over the years by doing longitudinal studies where you take the same speakers at say age 1 and then you track them over time, sorry, like age 10 and then at talk to them at 50 again and see how things change. But also, at one point in time, you take a look at, say, 10-year-old speakers and 40-year-old speakers and 70-year-old speakers, and you take a look at the differences in how they talk. And you take a look at this variation, and you analyze the differences between that 10-year-old, the 40-year-old, and the 70-year-old, and you use those differences to explain the past. So sociolinguistics, although as much as we try to explain what happens now in the present and what's going on, is very much a subfield that takes a look at how things have changed in the past. And we use present information and past information to describe those changes. Because we can't make predictions about what's going to happen. I mean, we can make predictions, but we don't know for sure what's going to happen. We can make our best guess, but we really need to just analyze what has happened in order to analyze facts, if we want to know the truth anyway. So 2 ways we can do this: by taking a look at what all people of all ages are doing now, and also take a look at what people are doing now and track those same people over time to see how those people are changing. And those 2 methods simultaneously, or those 2 methods together, give us the best information that we can get. So we get a snapshot in time and we see how that changes as time moves on. So fortunately, unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, one of these studies is really cheap. The other one that was mentioned in chat earlier, which was a very good point early, that these studies where you find the same people and track them over time, they're very expensive and participants drop out. Okay. A standard English. Here's another question. Is there a standard English? I think this question was asked in Discord. And the question is like, yeah, there is a standard English. And every little dialect will have their own standard of English. So if there is a standard, if you have a dialect, there's a standard. And usually the dominant dialect is the standard. So whatever is the highest prestige, whatever is the ideal version of the language. Now, what is the ideal version? What is the dominant version? It can change. It's just what people perceive as. So there's not really a formula to figuring this out. It's just the general perception of the population. So usually this is what's written in the rule books, or what's spoken on the news, or what's written in newspapers. Whatever is used in those mediums is what is considered the standard, and it's what's taught in school. And each of these standards have a perception. It's the one that's good, it's pure, it's rule governed. The ones that aren't standard are chaotic and limited and bad. And I mean, none of these are true. Non-standard varieties are rule governed as well. There's no such thing as a good or pure dialect. There's no such thing as a broken or chaotic dialect. They're all the same. So there are standards. A standard is prestige. So a standard is considered as more formal. It's the one that's used to address a lot of people. But it's just another dialect. These are all just social judgments. They're not linguistically motivated. There's no such thing as a linguistic standard. It's just a social standard. So a lot of words here to just express that. A standard is just, it's a socially constructed best form of the language. It's completely socially constructed. Linguistically, there's no motivation for what the standard is. It's either historically constructed or socially constructed. And so this ties in. So we can rate dialects of how good they sound, or how pleasant they sound, or how standard they are. And how we know that dialects are just socially constructed is that if we don't know other dialects, we don't really distinguish them in ratings. So if Americans or Canadians listen to different British dialects, we'll rate them as all the same because we can't tell the difference between them. So if we're talking about the standard British dialect, Americans and Canadians can't tell the standard and non-standard dialects apart. So we know it's socially constructed because we can't tell the difference. It's just made up in terms of what British perceive as being the best. And what comes out of this is something called the matched guise studies. And here's something really interesting. So this kind of brings back into discrimination and all this stuff. So matched guise studies are interesting because you can take the same stimuli. So you can have someone say something and you can have other people listen to it. And even though they say the same thing, that same thing might get different ratings, like wildly different ratings for how acceptable or how good it is, depending on how that stimulus is presented. So maybe that stimulus is presented with a picture of a British person's face, or maybe it's a Canadian's face or a Chinese person's face, but it's the same line being presented. Or maybe it's the same, or maybe it's an accented line and different faces come up. And they get different ratings depending on which face they see. So let's take a look at this. This is a study that's been done at UBC. So they had an audio line. So some voices of Canadian English speakers, native English speakers. And they showed either a white face or a Chinese Canadian face. So they just played native English speaker audio and showed one of two faces, white Canadian face or Chinese Canadian face. Depending on which face which face the listeners saw, they rated the audio file as being higher or lower depending on the face. So if they saw a white person's face, they saw, oh yeah, it's good. I can understand it. It sounds great. If they saw a Chinese Canadian face, that same audio file spoken by a native English speaker, they said, oh, it's hard to understand. Even though it's the same audio file spoken by a native English speaker. It's just the face that changed. But they said it was harder to understand because they saw a picture of a Chinese Canadian's face. More so than that, when they had to write down the sentences that were spoken, so they just wrote the words that they heard out, not only judging, but just repeating word for word, they made less mistakes for the white face, and they made more mistakes for the Chinese face. So there's some accent discrimination going on here too. And this is an example of the matched guise effect because the same stimuli is being used, the same audio file is being heard, but the way it's presented is different, and that's causing different effects. So, even though we all have different accents and different dialects and all this stuff, and really linguistically, there's no difference. I mean, well, linguistically, we hear things, but linguistically, all accents are equal, all dialects are equal. There's no different judgment. There's still some discrimination going on inside the heads of people. So research has proven that there's accent discrimination from researchers at UBC. So there's discrimination and there's stereotyping. So some dialects are bad, they're uneducated. When we think about African American vernacular English, that's been brought up in chat, usually, at least in the past, the perception has been that that's an uneducated dialect, and that's not an okay stance. Or that it doesn't have rules, which is one of the very first things that we talked about in the course, that the misconception about African American English is that there's no rules, but that's also false. It has its own grammar. It's a perfectly fine dialect. It's just as complicated as other dialects of English. So, there's there's prejudices against certain dialects, and that those prejudices against language lead to discrimination towards groups. And this isn't linguistic. This is just completely social. The fact that we hear certain words or certain sounds or certain grammatical constructions and we associate negative things with this isn't linguistic. There's no linguistic reasons for this to happen. This is not bad grammar. This is not chaotic or limited or broken structures. These are all just social constructions. And here's something. Well, hold on, Trevor. Surely there are accents that are like really hard to understand, right? Well, as long as the sounds are mostly acquired and they're close to the pronunciations of the words. And what I mean is that if they're pronouncing a P, they're in the P area. If they're pronouncing a TH, they're at least close to the TH, like they're making a dental S or something, like an S near the teeth, and they're close to that sound. It's a little bit more work to interpret what's being said, but we can still understand it. The brain is really good at interpreting sounds that are close to where they should be. So it takes a little bit more work to process the information, but it's not harder to interpret it. We just need to put in more effort. So if you run into someone who's like, oh, I can't understand you, your accent is too thick, whatever that means. Usually what it means is that they're just being a little bit lazy. And another interesting fact that has been shown is that native speakers of English who hear more people speak different dialects of English with different sounds, different vocabulary, and so on, they can understand foreign accents faster. So they can associate those closer sounds, so those sound errors, with the correct sounds for English much faster. So the more practice you hear, or the more practice you have listening to people who make mistakes, the better you are at correcting those mistakes in your head. So there's no excuse for giving up on trying to understand someone who has an accent. And this lecture is the reason I believe that linguistics should be taught in high school. Total aside there. Okay. Any questions about accents and dialects before we talk about the final topic in sociolinguistics? Okay. The last one is context. So this is what happens when languages meet. And well, not always when languages meet, but when people meet who speak different languages. So as a reminder, when we ended on last class, we talked about this thing called register. So language is context specific. We don't just use language in a void. We always use language for a purpose, and it's usually always for some social purpose. So we choose which words we use, which structures we use, how we pronounce those words, how fast we talk, and so on. And the way that we pick all of those things is what's called a register. And I think last class when I talked about register, I almost made it seem like it was more about like how fast I talk or how I enunciate or whatever. But like, I just want to emphasize that it's more about all of those things. It's about what the context is, what the purpose is, the word choice, the patterns, the speed, the pronunciation, and about the entire context. So it's about the register you use for, say, a job interview. It's like, that's the situation. There's a register associated with that. The whole works. The whole works for talking with friends. The whole works for talking with family. Your customer service voice, and so on. So these are the different contexts that you would use different registers for. And when you live in an area with more than one dialect or more than one language, and you're choosing between different registers or different languages to speak, you can either accommodate others, or you can choose not to accommodate others. You can diverge. So this is a choice that you make. Do you want to be kind and include others? So let's say you're talking with a coworker who speaks a different dialect that you also speak. So you might speak two dialects of English. Like let's say you're an Irish, let's say you come from Ireland, you speak, you have like an Ireland accent or an Irish accent, but you also have a Canadian accent, and you have a coworker who has an Irish accent only and doesn't have a Canadian accent. You can choose to use an Irish accent with him, or you can just use your Canadian accent. You can accommodate him. You can accommodate him by using Irish to Irish, or you can diverge and say, hold on, I don't really want to associate myself with Irish anymore, and then use Canadian to Irish instead. So you can say, I don't really want to associate with my Irish accent with you. I don't really want to be with you anymore. I don't want to associate with you. I want to diverge. I want to use my Canadian accent. So you can choose. That's one of the choices you have as an individual. And for a lot of people too, just brought up in chat, I wonder if there'd be a disconnect if you're used to using your Canadian accent at work and then switching to an Irish dialect when talking to that one coworker. A lot of people will do it subconsciously, and a personality will come out as well. So that's one of the things that can happen is when you see that person, it'll just automatically come out because that's your personality that comes out as part of when people drink. You see that often. Their native dialects will come out when they drink because that's what they uh, go to when they don't think, and their original personality comes out. Other times, yeah, they might want to stay professional. They might want to keep an appearance for their boss, so they don't want to switch to an Irish dialect. It depends on the work environment. It depends what their goals are. It depends how they want to identify themselves. So that can accommodate. Other times, again, for business purposes, you might want to stick with a certain accent or a certain dialect. So you might want to stick with what's called the lingua franca. So the lingua franca is like the major language used for like typically commercial communication. So usually we talk about the world's lingua franca, in which case it's English, and specifically the academic world and business world right now. Most people use English to do business, but in smaller areas of the world, they might have like their own little lingua franca. So in India, Hindi is the lingua franca. So anyone in India would use Hindi for their prime language of communication. Or in East Africa, um, sorry, autocorrected to France. If you're in the marketplaces in East Africa, you want to use Swahili because that's the language that they'll all speak. So depending on the region you're in, you can accommodate or diverge from people, and you may choose to accommodate more often or diverge more often, you know, for practice for business purposes to maintain a lingua franca. This is often, by the way, the lingua franca is often the reason that people will learn another language. So if you're learning English right now, or if you've learned English in the past, probably for business or academic reasons. If you're learning Mandarin at this point in life, it's probably for business reasons. Now, what happens when people who speak different languages have to communicate with each other? but they don't share any words in common. They don't share any patterns in common, but they have to communicate. Well, then something called a pidgin is formed. So pigeons are not full languages, and they don't have any first language speakers, and they don't really come up due to good reasons. Usually it's because like business has to happen and there's no way to get a translator, so it's like historical reasons, um, or isolative reasons, uh, or things like slavery, where you had a bunch of slaves who couldn't communicate with each other, so they had to develop a way to communicate. So pigeons come up. So basically, all these people are taking words and small little parts of phrases, and they're trying to understand each other. So you get these really simplified mini languages. They don't have very many words, so you can't express things like the difference between like a blanket and sheet. You just have words for like cover, for example. Many of the items are very ambiguous, so you need context. Uh, because there's not very many words, there's a lot of different roundabout ways to describe stuff. So instead of saying friend, you'd say like him, brother, belong, me, because you have these 4 words. So instead of introducing a new word, you would just use the ones you already had. And there's not very many grammatical rules because, again, you're not developing an entire language. You're just trying to communicate with the people around you to get business done or to get a job done. You're basically developing something from scratch for communication purposes. So these are pigeons. Um, this isn't really something that we're going to look at too much because it's not interesting. What's more interesting is what pigeons develop into, which is what's called a creole. So when people speak a pidgin for a long enough time and they develop into a community, you get what's called a creole. So a creole is a much more advanced pidgin, and it's basically a full language. I mean, linguistically, we consider it a full language, but society does not. So whenever society sees a creole, they're like, "Oh, that's not a language; it's a creole." In fact, you hear creole and you think, "What is that?" So creoles are full languages that have more lexical items, so more words, and more grammatical distinctions. And furthermore, children speak it as a first language. So these are communities now. People are having kids. People are starting to speak the language. So they started as pigeons and they become creoles. So let's take a look at a couple, and that'll be the end. So Tok Pisin is one of the prime examples. So this is in Papua New Guinea. And both of the ones we're looking at came from English. So we're going to see some very heavy English influence here. So let's just take a look at the words. And when we take a look at the words, we're going to see that they sound a lot like English words. And we're going to see that the sentence structure is a lot like English too, but it's not quite English. So for instance, the word no good means bad. And this sounds a lot like the word no good. By and by means by and by. So this could mean soon, but it comes from by and by. Sekan comes from shake hands. It means to make peace. Kilim comes from kill him, so meaning to kill. And grass comes from grass, and that means grass or hair or fur. So we can see a little bit more ambiguity here. So we need some context with a word like grass. Now, if we take a look at a full sentence, we can see a lot of the words sound similar. So me dreamin', long kilium one pela snake. So me, well, very clearly I, dream on, dream, we have some sort of past tense marker here. Long, who knows what that is? It's probably I. Kill, well, another past tense, who knows how that works? Wan Pela, who knows what that is? And snake. So we can make out a lot of it without really knowing the language, just because it developed from a pidgin that had a lot of English influence here. So Not on the assignment, but on the practice exercise, you're also going to take a look at how the sounds changed. So we'll see an example with the second one here. So here's Cameroonian Pidgin. I know what's called Cameroonian Pidgin, and I say it's a Creole example. It's because it starts as a pigeon and then it becomes a Creole, but it maintains the word pigeon in the name. It is a Creole. It used to be a pigeon, but it's still called Pidgin as the title. Okay, so here's another English-based Creole. This one has a simpler set of pronouns, and it also has fewer prepositions. So in this one, when you see the word for, it means to, at, in, on, and so on. So instead of having all these different prepositions, they just say for. So this is great. So we can just say these sentences and we understand them. I didn't even really need to give you the interpretations, but here they are. So A, give the book for me. Give the book for me means give the book to me. So this sounds like English. Give the book for me. But for is now the word to because they don't have different prepositions for to and in and at. They just say for. I day for fam. I day for fam. A little bit harder for this one. Again, the pronouns are simpler. So they don't have anything for she. They just say I in this case. Also, fam, they don't have an R here. They also don't really have a word for the. So they just say farm. I mean, they have D for the before, but they don't say it here in that position. So that's interesting. Maybe they don't need it at the end of a sentence. Them day for chose. They are in the church. Okay, a little bit more complicated there too. So maybe not all the time. Is it obvious what each sentence means? But we can see a lot of English in there. We can see a lot of sounds that are similar. So usually with Creoles, we could actually take a look at all of the words and we could figure out how the sounds have changed from English into the Creole. We could take a look at the sentence structure and we could figure out how we can take an English sentence and translate it into the Creole. So here's sort of like an intro question for you and to see like what you would be doing on your assignment. So what did the sound th, so that's the voice th, in English, what did that become in Cameroonian Pidgin? So for instance, here's the word they are in the church. So how is th being pronounced in Cameroonian Pidgin? Yeah, D. So this is becoming D in Cameroonian Pidgin. So I'm trying to find another word, but it's not yeah, here's another example for the D, give D book for me. There's two examples here. I'm trying to say like, okay, well, what if we had another word? How could we translate that? But the words I'm thinking of in my head are not on the sheet. So here's a question then. Here's something that's not in or on in any of the examples. But the TH sound, the voiceless one, this one is probably not going to be in Cameroonian Pidgin. It's a tough sound. If they don't have, they probably don't have. My question for you is just based on the sounds that they have, do you think this is going to be a D or do you think this is going to be a T? And the answer to this one, without any information here, is that I don't actually know. But I'm posing the question because it's one of those things that we might need more data for. But it's something to think about because the reason I say this is because there's words like at that could give us information, but the problem is it's changed to 4. But what I also notice is that, well, every other voiceless sound becomes voiceless. So church becomes an S. The F's stay an F. The K stays a K. So I think it's pretty likely that it's going to stay a T. That's probably what's going to happen. Oh, but we don't know for sure. It's probably going to happen. But what's really interesting here, here's I guess we can do one more. What do you think what is the V sound change to? F. F. The V sound has changed to F. Yeah. So this one's a little bit more interesting because why is the V sound changed to an F? So they can have voiced stops like duh and buh and guh, but for some reason when it's like a fricative, like a s or a f, it's got to be voiceless. They don't want voice stops. So, if we ask, well, if we had a word like zoos and we wanted to bring this over into Cameroonian pidgin, they're probably going to say something like sus. They're probably going to change it like that. So we can make predictions about how these words in English would be translated over into Cameroonian pidgin. So that's sort of what you're going to be doing in the Hawaiian question. So just sort of leading you with a couple of different sounds. Of course, the data set that I've given you has very precise answers. Well, this part with the TH was a little bit more off the cuff. Just very, very Seuss. Anyways, that's it for sociolinguistics. Again, sociolinguistics is just so many different topics to cover. So I know it felt quite jumpy. But yeah, that's why we have an entire lower division elective course for sociolinguistics, Ling 160, language and culture, language, culture, and thought, society. Hold on, what's the course called? This is bad. Ling 160 SFU. Language, culture, and society. That's the course title. Sorry, I've never taught it and I've never taken it. I'm just really familiar with the syllabus. Yeah, there's an entire course on that. So if you're interested in this stuff, Ling 160, I think, covers most of it. And that's an entire 13-week course with a lot of writing and discussion posts and multiple choice and written exams. But yeah, if you have any questions, I have to leave in 10 minutes so I can stick around for that. But other than that, I will see you next week. There is a practice exercise with some sociolinguistics questions due next Wednesday. But that's it. And most of them are stuff we've done today. So I will see you next week. Enjoy the rest of your day and week, and the grades will be posted by Friday.